I only needed shelter, but this silent organ seemed to remember my family.
She was 20 and homeless. No family, no savings, no place to sleep. Just a torn canvas bag and $5 she had counted 3 times before leaving the bus station behind her. And with that $5, she bought a forgotten pump organ loft near Brattleboro, Windham County, Vermont, in 1987, the year the place fell off county maps. The floor joists had collapsed. The bellows leather had rotted away. Windham County condemned it in 1985 and scheduled its demolition for the following spring season. Inside its sealed oak valve compartment, unopened for decades, waited a hidden inheritance of money, music, and a secret that would alter the direction of Hazel's life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Hazel had been listening her whole life without knowing it. She grew up in a small Vermont apartment where sounds carried farther than conversations. The radiator knocked before dawn, old floorboards answered every footstep, and a cracked clock on the kitchen wall kept time unevenly. She learned early that broken things were often kept because someone still believed they had a purpose. Her first years were spent moving between temporary rooms and borrowed furniture. The people who raised her provided shelter, but affection arrived like a scheduled appointment, measured and practical. She learned not to ask for more than what was placed in front of her. The one person who treated her curiosity as a gift was her grandfather figure, Hazel Voss, an old reed organ craftsman who lived outside town. Every Saturday morning, Hazel rode her bicycle to his workshop, where the smell of beeswax, cedar shavings, and machine oil filled the narrow room. Elias repaired forgotten pump organs from churches, farmhouses, and abandoned schools. He showed her how to listen to a reed before touching it, how to feel a leak in a bellows seam by the change in resistance, and how patience was a tool just like a file or a knife. Their weekend ritual was simple: tea on the workbench, one repaired piece placed on the cloth, and a quiet hour of careful hands. Every instrument remembers the hands that save it. He meant that repair was never only about wood and metal. The work carried forward the care of people who had come before, even when their names were no longer spoken. When Elias died, his workshop was emptied before Hazel arrived. The small jars of screws, the tuning forks, the handwritten repair notes, and the old reed knives disappeared into other homes. She kept only the sound of his lessons, buried somewhere deeper than any object. The years after that became narrower. Her foster parents, who had welcomed her as a child, began treating her presence like an account ledger. They watched benefit letters, counted expenses, and spoke about her future in terms of what support checks would bring. When the government payments ended, their patience seemed to end with them. On the morning of April 2nd, 1985, Hazel found a cardboard box beside the front door. Inside were 3 shirts, a worn paperback, and the blue scarf Elias had given her. Her mother stood by the kitchen window without turning around. "We cannot keep paying for you anymore." 8 words. Nothing more followed. Hazel waited for an apology, a question, even a glance toward the door. The woman remained still, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. Hazel picked up the box, closed the door softly, and walked away without hearing footsteps behind her. For 6 weeks, she moved through towns that barely noticed her. She slept one night beneath a covered picnic shelter in Bennington, 3 nights on a church basement cot in Rutland, and several evenings inside the waiting area of a bus station in White River Junction when the staff allowed her to stay until morning. Her money fell from $5 to $2.40, then to 60 cents after a bowl of soup and a local bus ticket. She washed her clothes in public restroom sinks and dried them beneath hand dryers. A rainy afternoon brought her into the Brattleboro Public Library. She sat near the heating vent, turning pages of old classifieds because she needed something that did not require references or a permanent address. Between furniture sales and farm notices, she found a small advertisement offering an abandoned pump organ loft for sale, the entire property available for a single $5 payment. The listing carried no promise. It mentioned repairs, isolation, and a structure most people had already forgotten. Hazel read the notice until the letters blurred, then copied the address carefully onto the back of a library receipt. The next morning, she used her last coins for a bus ticket heading south. She carried the canvas bag, the blue scarf, and the belief that a forgotten place might still have room for someone forgotten too. She folded the advertisement into the back cover of Elias's old paperback, the only book she still carried. The paper softened at the edges from rain and handling, but the address remained clear. For the first time in weeks, she had a destination that was not measured by how long she could stay. The road toward Brattleboro waited beyond the glass of the bus window, carrying Hazel toward a wooden loft that had been silent for decades and a door that had not yet been opened. The bus left her beside a weathered road sign outside Brattleboro just after sunrise, with frost still holding to the grass along the shoulder. Hazel stepped down with her canvas bag, the blue scarf tied around the handle, and watched the driver disappear into the pale morning distance. She walked the first 4 miles because she needed to save what little money remained. The road curved past stone walls, maple trees, and quiet fields where old barns leaned toward the ground. Near dusk, she found an empty hay barn behind a closed dairy farm and slept beneath a wool blanket she had been carrying since leaving home. The temperature dropped to 19 degrees Fahrenheit that night, and she woke several times when the wind pushed through gaps in the wooden siding. The following morning she reached the town by foot. Brattleboro was smaller than she imagined, but it carried the marks of a place that had once built things by hand. She passed the old storefronts along Main Street, walking by Mocha Joe's Cafe, Ostein's Shoe Repair, the Brattleboro hardware store, a small bakery with flour dust on its front window, and a family grocery where wooden crates sat beside the entrance. The county clerk's office occupied the second floor of an older brick building near the courthouse square. Hazel climbed the stairs slowly, holding the advertisement in one hand and the folded deed papers she had been mailed in the other. She expected questions about money, identity, or why someone her age wanted a condemned structure. Instead, the room was quiet except for the clicking sound of a typewriter from the back desk. The clerk looked up when Hazel entered. She was an older woman with silver hair pinned tightly behind her head and a small burn mark across 2 fingers of her left hand, the kind left by years of cooking rather than accident. Her nameplate read, Eleanor Whitcomb. "Can I help you?" Hazel placed the papers on the counter. "I am here for the organ loft deed." Eleanor adjusted her glasses and read the document twice. The room seemed to become smaller as her eyes moved across the page. "You understand what you're buying?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there is no electricity connected?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county condemned the structure and will not repair it?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the road is private. The winter access is difficult, and no one will be responsible if you decide it is too much." "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor looked at Hazel for a long moment. She did not seem suspicious. She seemed like someone measuring whether a person understood the weight of a choice. The brass stamp came down with a firm metallic sound. Ink pressed into paper. The deed became official. Eleanor slid the documents across the counter and pointed toward a hand-drawn map. "Take Upper Dummerston Road until you see the old Walnut line. Then follow the narrow track past the stone wall. The cottage sits beyond the creek." Hazel thanked her and tucked the papers away. Before she reached the door, Eleanor spoke again. That surname. Hazel turned. "Voss. Where did you hear it?" "My grandfather taught me repairs." The clerk removed her glasses. "Elias Voss." Hazel nodded. Eleanor rested both hands on the desk. Her expression changed. not with surprise, but recognition. He came here every winter. 30 years ago, he repaired the old organs at the churches around this county. People still remember his work. Hazel had not heard anyone outside Elias's workshop speak his name in years. "He owned this place?" she asked. Eleanor looked toward the window where snow moved lightly across the square. "Not exactly. But he cared for it. Some people leave behind houses. Some leave behind what they taught." She gave Hazel the deed envelope and a small brass key. The previous owner left instructions that whoever received this property should be given this. The walk to the loft took nearly 2 hours. Upper Dummerston Road narrowed into a rough track covered with frozen leaves and old snow. A neighbour named Walter Pike was clearing branches beside his mailbox. A tall man with a red wool cap pulled over one ear. A black and white dog sat beside him, watching Hazel carefully. "You headed to the old organ place?" Walter called. "Yes." The dog stood, sniffed the air, then returned to the snow. "Been empty a long time," Walter said. "Wind gets through every crack." Hazel thanked him and continued. The property appeared behind a line of walnut trees whose branches twisted above the path like old hands. The structure was smaller than she expected, but carefully made. The main building measured roughly 24 feet by 30 feet, built with hand-cut timber, fieldstone foundation, and dark walnut exterior boards that had faded almost grey. The roof sagged near the eastern side. The chimney leaned slightly toward the creek, and above the entrance hung a wooden sign with only 2 words carved into it: Esty Loft. Hazel stood there for several minutes before opening the door. The first thing she noticed was the smell. Old wood, dust, and dried leaves mixed together beneath the colder scent of stone. Her boots pressed into a floor covered with years of dirt. The air felt still, as if the building had been holding itself quiet. The front room contained the remains of a small living space. A narrow table leaned against the wall. A cracked lamp rested beside an empty chair. In the back room, she found the workshop. Shelves lined the walls, covered by cloth and dust. The outline of old tools remained where they had once hung. When she touched the wooden surface of the nearest bench, a faint smell of cedar rose from beneath the grime. She ran her hand across the grain and felt the uneven marks left by another person's work. That night, Hazel slept on the floor beside the workshop stove. She used her coat as a pillow and watched moonlight move slowly across the ceiling beams. The building creaked around her, not loudly, but with the careful sounds of something adjusting after years of silence. She did not know whether the loft could become a home. She only knew it had allowed her to enter. The strongest music came from pressure passing through a narrow opening, just as the strongest people did. The first 3 days passed through small repairs rather than grand changes. Hazel carried water from the old stone well behind the loft, clearing leaves from the bucket line and testing the rope until it stopped catching against the pulley. The outhouse door had swollen shut from years of moisture, so she shaved the edge with a borrowed knife and worked it open before evening. At night, she lay awake learning the language of the floorboards, noticing which boards answered with a soft groan and which ones remained quiet beneath her weight. On the 4th morning, she walked into town looking for supplies. The hardware store sat between 2 older buildings, its front window filled with hand tools, lanterns, and faded advertisements from another decade. The owner, Martin Hale, had a missing tip on his right index finger and kept rubbing the empty space whenever he calculated measurements in his head. Hazel placed a short list on the counter. "I need tools, but I do not have enough money." Martin read the list, then looked at her hands. They look like working hands. "I can work." He opened a drawer beneath the register and pulled out a thin repair manual with a torn blue cover. "This belonged to my father. Take it. Bring it back when the pages know your fingerprints." Hazel opened a small account under her name, promising to pay as she could. Martin did not ask for a guarantee. He simply wrote the number in an old ledger and closed it. The first purchases were modest and exact. A chimney brush cost $8.50. A metal scraper was $3.25. A bag of lime was $6. Cotton gloves cost $2.75. A small box of nails was $1.90. She carried everything back in a cloth bag and spent that evening reading the manual 3 times. The pages explained repairs in plain language, written by someone who believed careful work could be taught to anyone willing to remain patient. The chimney became her first serious task. The bricks had absorbed years of dampness, and dark creosote coated the inner walls. Hazel climbed onto the roof with a rope around her waist and lowered the brush through the flue 1 section at a time. She scraped downward, lifted the debris, measured the build-up, and repeated the process until the brick channel opened again. It took 7 hours over 2 days. When she finished, black residue covered her sleeves and the roof shingles around her boots. She cleaned each piece before replacing it because Elias had once told her that a repairer should leave behind less evidence of struggle, not more. The first fire was lit during the 2nd week. Hazel watched the smoke rise, pause, and then pull cleanly through the chimney. She placed a small iron pot over the flame with beans, sonions, and dried herbs purchased from the grocery store. The meal was simple. It was also the first hot meal she had cooked in her own place. The workshop revealed itself slowly as the dust moved away. Hazel did not empty everything at once. She uncovered 1 shelf at a time, allowing each object to remain connected to the silence around it. There was a walnut tuning hammer with a smooth handle worn by decades of fingers, a set of brass reed files wrapped in oilcloth, 3 wooden moulds used for shaping organ parts, a cracked porcelain cup with a faded blue flower, a narrow notebook filled with measurements, a hand crank from an old air pump, and beneath the bench a small cedar disc, carved with the same symbol found on Elias's old tools. The room changed when she began working there. Not because it became beautiful, because it became useful again. One evening, while examining the rear section of the abandoned pump organ frame, Hazel noticed something unusual. The instrument had been left behind because the bellows were destroyed, but the wooden casing remained remarkably intact. She tapped the side panel with her knuckles and heard a sound different from the surrounding wood, a hollow note. She tapped again. The sound returned. Hazel brought a small scale from the workshop shelf and measured the panel weight. It was heavier than it should have been for its size. She removed a layer of dust and found a thin cedar disc fitted into the wood with unusual precision. She sat on the floor for several minutes before touching it. The disc had no rust, no decay, and no damage from insects. Someone had protected it carefully. She removed the piece slowly. Behind it was a narrow opening. Inside were 3 wrapped packages, each sealed with old linen cloth. Hazel did not tear them open. She placed them on the workbench, cleaned her hands, and waited until morning. The next day, sunlight entered through a broken window and fell across the packages. The first contained tools, not ordinary tools, but heirloom instruments made for fine organ work. The handles were walnut, the metal surfaces darkened from age but carefully maintained. The second contained raw materials, thin sheets of brass, small pieces of seasoned wood, and several strips of unused leather preserved in wax paper. The third was a small tin box. Inside were coins, folded documents, and a military medal. Hazel counted the money twice. The total was $47,600. The coins came from different years and places: 6 Morgan silver dollars, 4 Barber half dollars, 11 Indian head pennies, and 7 Mercury dimes. They were not arranged like a collection. They were stored like savings gathered slowly over a lifetime. The medal was dark with age. On the back was the year 1918. Hazel sat beside the workbench, holding it in her palm. There was no celebration. No sudden feeling that everything had become easy. Only the quiet understanding that someone had placed these things here and trusted that another pair of hands would eventually find them. That night, she did not open the letter folded beneath the documents. She carried the tin box outside and sat beside the creek behind the loft. The water moved over stones with the same patient rhythm she had heard inside the walls. Above her, branches shifted in the cold air, and the windows of the workshop glowed faintly behind her. For the first time since arriving, she was not measuring what needed to be repaired. She was listening. The strongest music came from pressure, passing through a narrow opening, just as the strongest people did. The morning after finding the tin box, Hazel cleaned the workbench before touching anything inside it again. She placed the folded letter beneath the window where the sunlight reached the paper without warming it too quickly. The handwriting was familiar before she read a single word, the narrow slant of the letters, the careful spacing between lines. The small curve beneath certain names belonged to Elias Voss. Her hands remained still for a long moment. Then she opened it. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then the house has chosen to hold you for a while, and my hands are no longer here to greet you. My name is Elias Voss. I write this from a small room at Brattleboro Memorial Hospital after Dr. Samuel Whitaker confirmed that I have pulmonary fibrosis, a disease that has slowly reduced my ability to breathe. I received the diagnosis in November of 1954 in Brattleboro, Vermont. And I know there are things I must leave behind before my breath becomes too short for writing. You should know where the tools came from. My great-grandfather Johann Voss was born in 1822 in Mainz, Germany, and came to Vermont in 1848, where he repaired cabinet organs near Bellows Falls. His son, Albert Voss, born in 1851, worked in Brattleboro and joined the Este Organ Company in 1873. Albert taught my father, Samuel Voss, born in 1884, who continued the trade after serving local churches throughout Windham County. I was born in 1912, and I learned from Samuel in the same workshop where these tools now rest. The trade closed its doors on June 30th, 1956. That date marked the end of my family's official work with reed organs. After that, I repaired quietly for neighbours and churches when someone remembered the old sounds. More than 30 years passed with fewer people asking and fewer instruments surviving. The medal you found belonged to my brother, Thomas Voss. He was lost during the First World War while serving with the United States Army in France in 1918. My family kept his memory beside the workbench because he believed every broken thing deserved an honest attempt at restoration. The craft is simple only when explained poorly. A good bellows repair begins with clean leather, cut with care and attached without forcing the material. The hide must rest at room temperature before fitting, and the adhesive should be mixed at a ratio of 3 parts glue to 1 part water. Reed tuning requires patience. A brass reed should be adjusted by removing only small amounts of metal, never more than necessary, until the vibration reaches the proper note. When regulating air pressure, the felt valves should be seated evenly, with enough softness to close without resistance. Do not rush because the instrument is old. Age does not make something worthless. The work matters because someone once cared enough to create it, and someone else cared enough to keep it. I placed the money here because tools alone are not enough. A person rebuilding a life needs time, materials, and the freedom to make mistakes without fear. Use what is needed. Keep what remains for another person who may one day stand where you are standing. If you're reading this while feeling unwanted, remember that a thing can be forgotten and still have value. A house can close its doors and still be a home. A voice can disappear and still leave a song behind. I hope you repair something here, perhaps an organ, perhaps a chair, Perhaps a part of yourself that someone else failed to protect. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Elias Voss, March 14th, 1957. Hazel read the letter once, then again. The second time, she noticed details she had missed before, the slight change in pressure where Elias's hand had weakened near the end, the small mark where ink had pooled beside his name. The original folds pressed into the paper from decades of being carried and stored. She folded it along those same creases. Not different ones. The same ones. She walked through the back door after placing the letter beside the tools. Behind the loft, near the edge of the creek, she found the marker Elias had described. It was a flat piece of granite set beneath a walnut tree, almost hidden beneath moss. The stone held one name, Samuel Voss. No grand words. No dates carved deeply. Only a name kept in place. Hazel cleared the moss with her fingers and sat beside it until the afternoon light changed. That evening, she returned to the workshop and lifted the old porcelain cup from the shelf. She cleaned it carefully, filled it with tea, and placed it beside the repaired tools. It was the first object from the workshop she allowed herself to use. The next morning, small kindnesses began returning to her memory. Martin Hale had placed extra nails into her account without mentioning it. Walter Pike had left a bundle of dry firewood beside the path after seeing smoke from the chimney. Eleanor Whitcomb had given her the brass key because she believed Elias's instructions still mattered. A woman from the grocery store, Margaret Bell, had slipped 2 apples into Hazel's bag during her first week in town and pretended it was a mistake. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, what is one small kindness someone gave you that you still remember years later? Hazel spent that evening repairing the old workshop table. She did not hurry. She sanded the rough edges, tightened the loose joints, and placed the tools back where they belonged. When night arrived, she slept beside the workbench with the letter and the heirloom tools resting on the shelf above her. For the first time in years, the things around her were not borrowed. They were waiting for her hands. The first snow arrived on December 3rd, 1987, leaving 7 inches across the walnut branches and the narrow path to the loft. Hazel woke before sunrise, brushed snow from the door, and read the roofing chapter of Martin Hale's old manual 3 times before touching a single board. The roof measured approximately 24 by 30 feet. She calculated that she needed 18 bundles of cedar shingles, 6 rolls of felt underlayment, and nearly 1,400 galvanized nails to cover the damaged sections properly. The numbers were not frightening. They were simply facts waiting to be handled. Martin placed a small roofing hatchet on the counter when she visited the hardware store. "My uncle used this," he said. "He would want it working." Hazel ran her thumb over the worn handle. "I cannot pay for it." Martin shook his head. "Then use it well." The next day, Harold Avery arrived from the next valley. He was 72. With a stiff left knee and a habit of tapping his measuring tape against his palm before speaking. He had repaired roofs for 40 years before retiring. "No money," Harold said when Hazel offered payment. "I need to pay you something." He looked toward the roof. "You already are." For 11 days, they worked through cold mornings and short afternoons. Hazel learned to replace a damaged sister rafter, snap a straight chalk line across uneven boards, and drive nails with 3 controlled strokes instead of 1 heavy blow. Harold watched her work. "That nail's proud." Hazel looked down. "Pull it." The nail came free. She replaced it. By mid-December, the eastern slope held firm beneath a clean layer of new shingles. Snow rested on the roof without falling through. For the first time, the loft stayed dry. The chimney required more patience than strength. Several bricks had begun spalling, breaking into thin flakes that collected like red dust beside the fireplace. The old mortar had turned soft and powdery between the joints. Hazel removed the damaged sections one brick at a time and rebuilt them with a mixture of hydraulic lime and fire clay, measured at a ratio of 3 parts lime to 1 part fire clay. The work lasted 3 weeks. Temperatures remained in the low 20s Fahrenheit, and every 15 minutes her fingers became too numb to hold the trowel correctly. She warmed her hands beside the small stove, then returned outside. She learned that cold made every movement slower. Not impossible, just slower. By late January, she rebuilt the upper section, sealed the cracks, and waited through the proper curing period before testing the chimney again. The first fire burned quietly. Smoke rose upward. The draft held clean. Hazel sat beside the flames for an hour, listening to the sound of the repaired chimney pulling air through the house. The floors revealed their age beneath layers of dirt and old finish. They were white pine planks, wide and uneven, secured with hand-cut rosehead nails that still held after more than a century. Hazel rented a random orbit sander from Martin for $14 per day. She started with 80 grit to remove the damaged surface, moved to 120 grit to smooth the grain, and finished with 220 grit until the boards felt quiet beneath her fingertips. The work filled the loft with the steady sound of motion. 3 coats of oil followed. Between each coat, she waited. The final cure required 48 hours. When the light entered through the repaired windows, the floor changed from a dull brown surface into something closer to dark honey moving toward mahogany. One morning, she planned to continue sanding the back room. Then she saw the great blue heron standing beside the marsh. The bird remained still for nearly an hour. Hazel set the tools down. She watched. That day, she did no work. The next morning, she returned to the floor. The windows took most of February because each one required different care. There were 8 in total. 3 had no glass remaining. 4 carried cracks that spread like frozen rivers. 1 original pane from 1788 remained intact, slightly uneven and full of tiny waves from the old glass-making process. Hazel preserved that pane. She repaired the others using DAP 33 glazing putty, pressing the material carefully into the wooden rabbets before setting each piece of glass. She learned to hold the glazing knife at the correct angle, creating smooth lines instead of thick ridges. The sash cords were replaced with 1/4-inch cotton rope. At each counterweight, she tied a figure-8 knot, tightening it until the windows moved without resistance. The final window was the one facing the walnut trees. Hazel worked slowly because the frame had warped over decades. When she finished, she stepped outside to check the seal. A chickadee landed on a walnut branch above her. It remained there for several seconds, looking through the clear glass. Then it flew away. The walls around the chimney were the last interior repair before spring. Hazel discovered that the original plaster had been built over hand-split oak lath, with small gaps designed to hold the material in place. Her first 3 patches failed. The first cracked because the surface had not been cleaned deeply enough. The second separated because the mixture was too wet. The third fell away after 2 days when the chimney warmed and expanded. She returned to the method described in Elias's notes. The repair required lime plaster mixed with horsehair from an old bag Martin Hale kept in the back of the hardware store. Hazel worked the fibres through the mixture until the plaster held together without becoming heavy. The first coat was a scored scratch coat pressed firmly into the lath. The second was a 3/8-inch brown coat that required a 72-hour cure. The final finish coat was only 1/8 inch, applied slowly with the edge of the trowel. When the last section dried, Hazel placed her palm against the wall. "These patches will hold another 100 years." The words stayed in the room after she spoke them. The people around the loft never became a crowd. They arrived one at a time. Doris, the cafe owner, had a habit of wearing a red wool sweater with one loose button near the collar. She began leaving paper bags on Hazel's doorstep containing bread, vegetables, and small jars of preserves. When Hazel tried to pay, Doris shook her head. "When the shop reopens," she said, "pay me in candles." Hazel did not understand at first. Then she saw the old candle moulds behind the cafe counter and understood Doris was asking for something made by hand. Not something bought. Caleb arrived in March on an old Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul tied across the back rack. He was 16, thin as a fence post, and always had sawdust caught in his dark hair from helping at his family's woodlot. He helped clear fallen branches near the creek and refused every dollar Hazel offered. "My mother said, 'About your grandfather.'" That was all he explained. He left the maul behind until the next visit. Reverend Boyd walked past the property each morning wearing the same brown coat, regardless of weather. He never entered without invitation. He simply lifted his hat when Hazel crossed paths with him. One morning, he stopped. "Keep the light burning." Then he continued down the road. It was the only prayer he offered. Hazel postponed the cellar until February 11th because there were always more urgent repairs above ground. When she finally opened the old cellar entrance, she found a space measuring 12 by 15 feet with a fieldstone floor and 7 granite steps descending beneath the cottage. The air below was colder, older. At the center of the floor sat a dressed granite slab marked with a carved symbol matching the one on Elias's tools. Hazel cleaned the surface. She did not lift it. Some things deserved to remain where they had been placed. While checking the third step, she noticed a small gap beneath the stone edge. A narrow oak box had been wedged underneath, protected from moisture. Inside was a brass key. The bow of the key was shaped like the symbol of the reed organ craft. There was also a tintype photograph dated 1903. The image showed a young woman standing outside the cottage, holding a woodworking tool in one hand. Hazel stared at the face longer than she expected. The woman looked remarkably like her. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "Female ancestor, daughter of founder, age 25, summer of 1903. The key remained on the mantel. Hazel never discovered what it opened. By March, the snow began retreating from the fields. The creek grew louder as ice broke apart, and small green shoots appeared beneath the walnut trees. Catkins hung from the branches before the leaves returned. Hazel considered beginning the full organ restoration that spring. She decided against it. The work deserved more preparation than excitement. She would use 1 coin from the hidden money for materials and practice first on smaller pieces, a reed, a valve, a single section of leather bellows. She wanted her hands to understand before they attempted to repair. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, the first completed heritage craft object rested on Hazel's workbench. It was not a full organ. It was a small restored reed cabinet made from salvaged walnut, with a repaired brass reed and a hand-stitched leather bellows section. The object fit beneath one arm, but it carried the same principles Elias had taught her decades earlier. Measure carefully. Cut once. Listen before changing anything. Hazel tested the reed in the quiet workshop. The note was not perfect, but it was honest. She adjusted the screw, softened the pressure, and tried again. This time, The sound held. The restored interior of the loft remained modest. The floors carried the marks of repair. The old table stood beside the window. Elias's tools rested above the bench. The 1788 glass pane still distorted the winter light into small waves across the wall. The cottage had not become new. It had become cared for. The brass key from the cellar remained untouched for years until one December morning when Hazel noticed something unusual about the oldest walnut tree beside the creek. A small brass plate had appeared beneath a layer of bark. She had walked past that section of the tree hundreds of times. The plate contained a narrow opening. The key fit. Inside the hollow space was a folded 48-star American flag and a sealed note wrapped in oilcloth. The paper inside carried handwriting from Elias's great-grandmother, written during the American Civil War. She had hidden the flag there while her husband, Samuel Voss, served away from home. The note explained that the tree was planted during the war years as a reminder that families could survive long seasons of separation. The flag was not displayed as a possession. It was kept as a witness. The military medal from the tin box belonged to Thomas Voss, and Hazel carried it to the Vermont Veterans Memorial Cemetery on November 11th, 2024, the anniversary of Armistice Day. She placed flowers beside the marker and held the medal for several quiet minutes before returning it to its case. The money was never spent carelessly. Hazel used 3 silver coins for materials during difficult months: leather, brass, and replacement wood. 2 additional coins paid for a tool repair. The remaining savings stayed sealed in the original tin box. On the lid, she wrote 4 words. For the next one, the shop reopened quietly. There was no announcement. Doris placed an index card on the cafe corkboard describing Hazel's repair work with old reed instruments and handmade wooden pieces. The card gathered names slowly. Within a year, more than 40 people had left their addresses for future repairs. Most were not looking for perfect instruments. They were looking for someone willing to listen. Caleb returned one spring morning carrying a wooden sign carved from walnut. He had grown taller. The old Schwinn was gone, replaced by a truck used for carpentry work. The sign read, "Daughters." Hazel ran her fingers over the letters. "You made this," Caleb nodded. "My mother said the old name was never supposed to end." She placed the sign beside the workshop door. Years later, Hazel began writing her own letter. She used the same opening words Elias had written. "My dear one, whoever you are." She wrote about the tools, the mistakes, the people who arrived without being asked, and the quiet work of keeping something alive after others had forgotten it. She did not know who would eventually read those pages. She only knew someone might need them. The strongest music came from pressure passing through a narrow opening, just as the strongest people did. The pump organ loft remained beside the creek, beneath the walnut trees, with its repaired windows and steady walls. It held the marks of every careful hand that had touched it. The pump organ loft waits. It has always waited. And in the county clerk's office, inside Eleanor Whitcomb's old desk drawer, the $5 bill Hazel used to purchase the forgotten property remained pressed between the pages of the original deed copy, not as a reminder of what she lacked, as proof that something small could still open a door.